Whether you sit in a temple, walk in the forest, or just sit quietly with your own thoughts, there's something inside you that wants to feel connected to life, to meaning, to something bigger. We all feel it in different ways, that pull, that question, that longing. Some people find answers in religion, in sacred texts, prayers, rituals, and faith communities that ground them. Others find it in silence, sunsets, or the unspoken feeling that something beyond logic is still deeply real. So, here's the question we're exploring today. Can you be deeply spiritual without being religious? For some, the answer is obvious. For others, it's complicated. And for many, it's a question that stirs up strong emotions, maybe even some confusion, guilt, or grief. This conversation isn't about choosing sides, it's about exploring the human heart. Because the truth is, this topic is tender. It touches on identity, family, culture, and the stories that shape our deepest beliefs. But even within all that complexity, one thing remains true. The soul seeks something more. Whether we call it God, Source, the universe, or simply wonder, there is a longing in each of us to touch the sacred. And sacred doesn't always wear robes. It doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it's found in tears, in music, in nature, or in the quiet whisper that says, "You are not alone." So, let's go deeper. Let's talk about what it really means to be spiritual, with or without religion. And more importantly, let's do it with compassion. Because no matter where you are on your path, you belong here. Ready? Let's begin. When people hear the word spirituality, they often imagine incense, yoga mats, maybe crystals or meditation cushions. When they hear religion, they might think of churches, temples, sacred texts, and long-standing traditions. And sometimes people talk about these two paths as if they're at war, as if you have to choose one and reject the other. But what if they're not enemies? What if they're not even opposites? What if spirituality and religion are simply different languages we use to speak about the same mystery? Let's start with religion. At its core, religion is an organized expression of spirituality that offers structure, sacred calendars, rituals, symbols, and shared stories. Religion creates a container for our sense of the divine. It tells us when to pray, how to gather, and what to believe. And for millions, it provides a deep sense of belonging to a tradition, to a lineage, to something greater than the self. Religions often come with beautiful frameworks. They offer sacred texts that carry the wisdom of generations, rituals that mark the stages of life, and moral teachings that help guide our actions. For many, religion is a map handed down by ancestors, a map that leads them toward truth, peace, and communion with the sacred. Spirituality, on the other hand, often starts from the inside out. It isn't always tied to doctrine or dogma. Instead, it's deeply personal. It can look like daily meditation or like feeling awe under a star-filled sky. It can be a practice, a path, or simply a feeling, an awareness that there's more to life than what we can see or measure. Spirituality asks, what does this mean to me? It evolves, it flows. It meets us where we are, not where tradition says we should be. And it welcomes our questions as much as our faith. That doesn't make spirituality better, it just makes it different. For some, spirituality and religion are beautifully woven together. A person might attend Mass, follow the teachings of the Bible or the Quran, and also meditate or work with energy healing. They don't see a contradiction, they see a fuller picture. Their faith gives them roots, and their spirituality gives them wings. Others find that religion no longer fits or never did. Maybe they were hurt by rigid interpretations or excluded for who they are. Maybe they felt like they had to choose between their intuition and the teachings of their church. And so they stepped away, not from the sacred itself, but from the structures that claimed to define it. This doesn't mean they've abandoned faith, it means they're rebuilding it on their own terms. And that's something we need to honor. Because here's the truth, some of the most deeply spiritual people you'll ever meet don't identify as religious at all. They may not know the names of saints or the words to hymns, but they live with reverence. They move through the world with an empathy, presence, and a sense of connection that runs deeper than belief. Spirituality is not a club. It has no membership fees, no dress code, and no gatekeepers. It is a relationship, not a system. And religion, at its best, it's a beautiful way of expressing that relationship in community. At its best, religion teaches compassion, humility, surrender, and service. It reminds us we are not alone in our seeking, that others have walked the path before us, and that we can walk it together. When either path loses its soul, when religion becomes rigid and punishing, or when spirituality becomes shallow and self-centered, we suffer. But when both are alive, open, and rooted in love, they can lead to the same place, a deeper connection to what is sacred. So no, spirituality and religion aren't enemies. They're more like dialects, different expressions of a shared longing. The longing to belong, to understand, to connect. One might chant in Sanskrit, another might sit in silence. One might follow scripture, another might follow synchronicity. But the heartbeat is the same. We're all trying to remember something sacred, something whole. You don't need to choose a side. You only need to be honest about what brings you closer to the truth of your own heart. And that, in itself, is holy. For many today, that honesty has led them down a path that exists outside of traditional religion. This isn't because they've given up on the sacred, quite the opposite. It's because they still yearn for it. They still listen for it. They still feel it moving through their lives in quiet, personal ways. But they are no longer looking for it in the same places. More and more people are choosing to seek the sacred beyond religious institutions, not out of bitterness, not out of arrogance, but because something inside them is being called elsewhere. It's not about rejecting tradition for the sake of rebellion. It's about listening inwardly and realizing, I need something different now. Many of these seekers were raised inside religious systems. Some found comfort there, others found confusion or even pain. Maybe they were silenced for asking too many questions. Maybe they didn't see themselves reflected in the teachings. Maybe they were taught to fear rather than to feel. For some, the decision to leave wasn't easy. It came with heartbreak. It meant losing a community, losing certainty, and sometimes even losing the approval of family. But even with all that loss, they couldn't ignore the quiet pull of their own inner truth. They needed to find the sacred in a way that felt alive, not just memorized. And so they turned inward. One of the deepest reasons people are choosing spirituality without religion is the desire for a direct connection, not through a priest, a doctrine, or a weekly sermon, but through their own experience, their own breath, their own silence. They want to feel the divine, not just be told about it. This is not a new longing, but in our time it's being supported by a wider range of tools and practices, many of which were once dismissed, but are now being revisited with curiosity and reverence. Meditation, energy work, intuitive listening, psychedelic healing, breathwork. These paths aren't about escaping reality, they're about coming home to it. There's also a growing awareness of how trauma, especially spiritual trauma, lives in the body. For those who were raised with fear-based teachings or taught that they were sinful by nature, the body remembers. And for many, healing looks less like kneeling in a pew and more like grounding in a therapist's office or sitting by a river or dancing freely beneath the stars. That healing is spiritual, even if it doesn't come with a label. Others walk away from religion not because they were hurt, but because they simply felt constrained. Their beliefs began to shift, their questions deepened. Their experiences no longer fit into the framework they were handed. And rather than deny that inner evolution, they chose to honor it. It's not that they've stopped believing in something sacred. It's that they're allowing that belief to grow and change as they do. And yes, there are critics. Some claim this path is too unstructured, too eclectic, too self-centered, that it lacks the grounding of tradition, the rigor of theology, or the accountability of community. But that's only part of the picture, because many of the people walking these personal paths are doing so with great care. They are not casually assembling a feel-good belief system. They are intentionally deconstructing old ideas, wrestling with truth, and rebuilding something that feels honest. Even if it's messy, even if it's slow. They are not leaving God behind. They are discovering that maybe God was never confined to a building in the first place. And for those who remain in religion with open hearts and sacred devotion, let's be clear, this isn't an attack. This is not a declaration of superiority. This is not us versus them. It's simply another expression of the same longing, the longing to feel connected, to feel whole, to feel held by something greater. It's not about walking away from the sacred. It's about walking toward it from a new direction with reverence, with courage, and with deep listening. What we're witnessing is not the end of faith. It's the transformation of it. A movement from external authority to inner wisdom, from memorized beliefs to embodied knowing, from fear of judgment to freedom of experience. And in that freedom, a new kind of sacred is emerging, one that doesn't always look like religion, but still holds the essence of what religion points to. The divine is still here, still calling. Only now we're learning to hear it in more voices. And maybe that's exactly what we've needed all along. The sacred doesn't only speak through scripture. Sometimes it shows up in the hush of dawn, or the pull in your chest when you hear a certain song. Sometimes it doesn't wear robes, it wears sky, or paint, or silence. You don't have to walk into a temple to touch something holy, because the sacred, for many, has moved beyond the walls. Today's spirituality is expressing itself in ways that don't always resemble religion, but are no less profound. Think of meditation. A person sits quietly, eyes closed, not trying to achieve or produce, but simply be. In that stillness, something ancient awakens. The mind softens. The breath becomes prayer. There may be no deity named, no creed spoken, yet the experience is deeply spiritual, a return to essence. Then there's nature. Trees have no sermons, but they still teach. Rivers offer no commandments, but they still guide. For countless people, walking through the woods or standing beneath a vast starlit sky brings them closer to the divine than any doctrine ever did. The rustle of leaves becomes scripture. The wind becomes a whisper from something greater. Art is another sacred space. Music, poetry, painting are all vessels for transcendence. A dancer in motion, a poet in flow, a sculptor shaping form from stone. These are acts of devotion. Not to dogma, but to the soul's expression. They are prayers without language. They connect us to something beyond ourselves, even as they pour from within us. And then there are the small moments, a child's laughter, the warmth of a hand held, a dream that feels like a message, the synchronicity that shows up just when you need it. These aren't coincidences for the spiritually attuned. They're signs, winks from the universe. Gentle reminders that we are not alone, not forgotten. Some find spirituality in movement, yoga, dance, walking meditations. Others find it in stillness, journaling, breathwork, contemplative solitude. Some feel it in psychedelic ceremonies, others in sound baths or energy healing. And for many, the most spiritual act is simply learning to listen to the body, the earth, the quiet voice inside. And none of this requires belief in a specific God or adherence to a particular path. It only requires presence, a willingness to feel, to wonder, to connect. Again, spirituality is not a club you need to join. It's not earned through memorizing verses or performing piety. It's accessed through aliveness, a heart open enough to be moved. Still, for those raised in traditional faiths, these expressions may seem unfamiliar, even suspect. Where are the rules, the rituals, the reverence? But perhaps the rituals are just different now. Lighting a candle before meditation, drawing an oracle card in the morning, writing down dreams and reading them like parables, sitting by the ocean and letting your tears blend with the tide. These are rituals too. They anchor us. They connect the seen and unseen. They remind us the sacred is not something we have to earn, it's something we are made of. It's important to say, just because a practice is unconventional doesn't mean it's shallow. The depth of any spiritual path depends on the sincerity behind it. A single moment of awe in nature can carry more spiritual weight than years of empty recitation. We must be careful not to mistake structure for depth or assume that freedom means frivolity. Some of the most disciplined, introspective, and heart-centered people walk paths with no name. Their spirituality may not follow a map, but they are deeply guided nonetheless. And just as religion can be beautiful when practiced with love, so too can spirituality outside of religion be holy. Because in the end, it's not about the form, it's about the presence, the connection, the remembrance. The universe speaks to us in 1,000 voices. Not all of them stand at altars. Some arrive in dreams. Some hum in the spaces between thoughts. Some show up in ordinary moments, made radiant by attention. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. To remember that the sacred was never confined, that it's in the breath, the body, the stars, the soil, that it has always been speaking. And now we are learning to listen in new ways. When we begin to walk our own path, whether it's rooted in religion, spirituality, or something in between, there's a subtle trap waiting for us. It's not always loud. In fact, it often disguises itself as clarity, confidence, or conviction. But it's really ego, dressed up as enlightenment. It says, "I figured it out, and if you haven't, you're still asleep." Spiritual superiority can creep in on any path, from the pulpit or the meditation mat, from the church pew or the vision quest. It doesn't matter how sincere the journey is. If we begin to believe that our way is the way, we've already lost touch with the very spirit we claim to honor. Let's be honest, it's easy to look at others and quietly judge. To see religious folks and think they're just following rules blindly, or to see spiritual seekers and think they've drifted into fantasy and fluff. Both assumptions are rooted in the same error, the belief that one lens on the sacred is more valid than another, that there is one blueprint for awakening and everything else is just a detour. But the truth is, the sacred meets each person where they are. There are monks who find transcendence through ritual. There are atheists who experience awe so profound it softens them to mystery. There are skeptics who pray in moments they can't explain, and mystics who still light candles even though they don't name a god. Depth, compassion, and transformation can exist anywhere love is present. And ego, the desire to be right, superior, enlightened, can exist anywhere love is forgotten. The spiritual ego is particularly tricky because it hides behind higher consciousness. It speaks in polished language, vibrations, levels, awakened versus asleep. But the tone gives it away. There's a tightness, a need to prove, to preach, to be above. Even ideas meant to free us can become cages. Take the phrase, "religious people are asleep." That's a judgment. It assumes a lack of awareness, when in reality there are deeply awake people in every faith, people whose devotion has softened them into profound humility, service, and joy. Or the reverse, spiritual people are lost. That too is a judgment. It erases the inner labor so many seekers do, the healing, the unlearning, the willingness to walk without a map. The truth is, awakening doesn't have a costume. It doesn't always look wise. It doesn't speak in perfect metaphors. It doesn't need crystals, nor does it need cathedrals. It just needs sincerity. A sincere heart can wear many clothes. It can kneel or dance or weep quietly on a morning walk. It can chant scripture or hold silence or laugh wildly at the mystery of it all. And in that sincerity, there is no room for superiority, only reverence. Because the moment we stop revering the sacred in others, we've disconnected from the sacred in ourselves. It's all connected, all one. To dismiss another's path is to close a door in the house of the divine. And yet, let's be compassionate with ourselves too. If you've ever felt a hint of spiritual pride, you're not alone. It happens. It's just the ego's way of wanting to belong, to matter, to feel certain in a world full of chaos. But the real path, the deep path, invites us not to conquer others with our truth, but to expand our hearts enough to hold multiple truths. Not everything that's different is wrong. Sometimes it's just a different song in the same choir. So let's walk gently. Let's stay curious. Let's remember that real wisdom bows, it doesn't boast. Because whether you find the sacred through incense or intellect, prayer or poetry, ritual or raw emotion, if it leads you closer to love, it's worthy. And if someone else's path does the same for them, it's sacred too. We don't have to agree on the form. We only have to recognize the light that lives within it. You don't need permission to be spiritual, only presence. You don't need a title, a temple, or a theology to touch the sacred. You just need a heart open enough to listen. Whether your altar is made of stone, sky, or silence, it is sacred because you are. So walk your path, whatever it looks like, in peace. Honor what feels true, release what doesn't, and know that your journey, even when uncertain, even when wordless, is valid. For some, the divine speaks in scripture. For others, it whispers in dreams, pulses through music, or moves in the rhythm of breath. There is no single path, only the one that calls you home to yourself. We are all seekers. We are all sacred. And in the vast mosaic of being, every honest path is a thread in the great tapestry of connection. So, keep going with compassion, with curiosity, and with the deep knowing that you are already part of something holy.